It's pretty much US and China right now. If you look at our leaderboards, if you go down the list of the model labs, they're all pretty much from the US, the top tier, and then we've got the challenger tier is the Chinese models, pretty much.
What are your juiciest predictions for 2026?
I was thinking long and hard about the different predictions, try and make them non-boring. The first ones that I was thinking about are the Chinese models. Chinese models, they're mostly open source. They have been getting up close to the top of the arena. And I put a couple of points there about the web dev arena, them leading on the web dev arena for a whole month, which hasn't happened before at all. So this is the Chinese open source model being the best at coding for a whole month.
What are the top open source models for Web Dev Arena?
For Web Dev Arena, we've got the two models right now, which are very close towards the top. So we've got Minimax M 2.1, and then we've got GLM 4.7, which are two models which are really close towards the top of the arena. They're about, if you look at the top labs, they're close, but there's always been that gap. If that happens, that could be that we've got a leading Chinese model on the top of the charts.
You think open source will do better than the proprietary ones?
That could happen. I think, if you go back and ask me maybe 6 months ago, the gap was always very obvious. And now we saw a few models that come really close to proprietary models, at least in some of the tests that we're seeing, some of the data we're seeing on the arena. So I think it's possible for that to happen, at least temporarily. So this prediction doesn't say they will now dominate forever. It says for 1 month. So that's about just less than 10% of the year, which I think is not too crazy. I think that's realistic.
I thought a lot of the open source models in image generation, at least, performed relatively poorly compared to proprietary models. What's different about Web Dev Arena where these open source models can excel?
Yeah, so coding has been one of these battlegrounds where proprietary models and open source models have really focused on. So I think there is a potential where a lab could really push through, come up with some new ways to train the models and really excel on coding. Again, it's one of those where I think a lab can push through and just dominate for maybe a month, and then another one takes over. So it's maybe not the hottest prediction. I think if we said the Chinese labs will dominate for the rest of the year, I think that will probably be a bit too far. You mentioned the image and video models. One thing I was thinking about for a while and hasn't happened yet is that, in my impression is that in China, the rich media is particularly important. So people use images, people generate videos, and it feels more advanced than in the West. And so far, the image and video models have not quite exceeded their Western counterparts, but I think it feels like just because the market is more important, it feels like it should happen at some point where the Chinese labs would care about it more. So it feels like they could overtake the US counterparts.
What are the top Chinese models in image and video gen?
With image gen, we had Qwen models, which have been doing really well. We'll see how they're going to rank on the arena. There's a new one that came out recently, so that will be interesting to see. It will probably not overtake yet the Gemini or OpenAI models in that space, but they could get pretty close. With the video models, we have Kling models have been particularly good, and a few others have been getting close towards the top. So again, they haven't quite made that leap to actually be better, but I think it could be the case that in China people just care about it more because of the market conditions, and they could just overtake the American counterparts.
When you're talking about geography, what are the main regions that actually are moving frontier AI forward?
It's pretty much US and China right now. If you look at our leaderboards, if you go down the list of the model labs, they're all pretty much from the US, the top tier, and then we've got the challenger tier is the Chinese models, pretty much. And then we have some Mistral models from France. Maybe there could be an odd one here and there, but it's pretty much between US and China right now.
Most of the major model labs, the ones that are big tech companies, are based in the US. How is China coming up with these really good AI models?
Yeah, China's got some really big tech companies as well. They've really grown up in parallel to the US ecosystem. So they've got a lot of data, they've got a lot of market power, they've got a lot of ability to utilize these models. So there is some purpose to them as well. And they seem to be really innovating as well to make it much more maybe efficient in the way they train the models and getting them up to the standard, maybe close to the US models without as many resources.
How is China releasing these kind of AI models with the resources that they have?
There's quite a lot of talk about Chinese labs being restricted from using the most performant hardware because of the export restrictions into China. So Chinese labs cannot easily buy GB 300 latest GPUs, for example, NVIDIA GPUs. But one thing they could do legally is to go to a cloud in Malaysia, for example, and run some GPU capacity there and train the models there. It might be the case that they're not maybe as disadvantaged as it might seem in terms of getting access to the latest hardware, and especially if they need to train maybe a model that's specifically focused on coding or specifically focused on image generation, maybe they could get away with maybe narrowing down the scope and really focusing on that capability. So we don't know for sure how much of what is happening where the different labs are training their models, but we know that ByteDance is one of the biggest customers of Oracle, for example. So it could be that they're utilizing some of the leading GPUs abroad and not within mainland China. So it could be that in practice they don't have as much of a disadvantage in terms of some raw computing power. But we've definitely seen some examples from papers from DeepSeek a year ago where they've made some big strides in terms of the efficiency of training of the models. Maybe a juicier prediction I put in there is that Chinese labs will open source less than 50% of their top models. So far, the trend has been is that China has been seen as one of the, and they quite deservedly so, have been a leader in open source, and they've pretty much open sourced most of the labs, most of the time open source their top models. We've seen a few examples. I think Qwen Max models haven't been open sourced. Then also, I think we've seen arenaai models have also not been open sourced. It could be the case maybe this year if the Chinese labs really starting to develop the best models, the most leading models, they stop giving them away. And especially if they're starting to invest loads more resources and going above and beyond and training the best models, then it's starting to get harder and harder to justify why they would give those away. And it was reasonable to say, as their challenger, they're probably not going to make a lot of money competing with Anthropic on selling inference for coding, such as like Claude Code or Cursor. There was not that much downside of giving your model away. But if they do have the best models, at least in some categories, then why give them away? Then maybe they start open sourcing them much less.
Why do you think China started off with such a strong open source culture?
I think it's because they were behind. And that was a way to gain mindshare and to gain developers on site. Because if you release a proprietary model and it's ranked 7th on the arena and it costs maybe a bit less or maybe not even less, then what's the point? You're not going to get any market share at all. And we've seen that the market is really extremely competitive. So unless you're in the top, then it doesn't really matter. Maybe it does matter if you are more optimized, maybe you've got fewer parameters, maybe you can run inference cheaper, and then it could matter because you can run it for less and you can give other advantages such as people can run it on their hardware. While you don't make money from it directly most of the time, you can get some mindshare and people start trusting more and start using more models such as Qwen or DeepSeek or many other models that we've seen.
Now that they've established this reputation, they've gained the trust of their users, and they're starting to rank higher on the leaderboards, now there's an opportunity to monetize?
Yeah, I think so. I think it could happen. It's not been entirely clear why there was so many labs doing open source in China, because at some point, if you roll it forward and if we believe the narrative that's coming out of OpenAI or Anthropic, where they invest in many, many tens of billions into their data centers, if at some point it does take $1 billion, $10 billion to train the best model, then how can you keep up? And if Chinese model does end up costing $1 billion, $10 billion to train, then it could be really hard business case for anyone to put together and say, yeah, let's just give it away. I think they would start expecting much higher return to investment at some point. And if you want to keep track of how this progresses over the next year, then check out the leaderboard. There's lots more juicy predictions, so check them out.